On a warm summer afternoon in 1940, the elegant Hôtel du Parc in Vichy bustled with unusual activity. Nazi officers in pressed uniforms came and went under the sandstone arches. On the ground floor of this grand hotel, which now housed Marshal Pétain's puppet government, sat a luxury boutique with its gilded sign gleaming, Louis Vuitton. Inside, the air was thick with equal parts fear and opulence. A well-dressed Frenchman, Henri Vuitton, stood behind the counter forcing a polite smile as a German official admired a custom suitcase. All around Vichy, shops had been shuttered by the occupation. But not this one. This boutique, the pride of the Vuitton family, was the only store allowed to stay open in the Hôtel du Parc. It was no coincidence. In back rooms and café meetings, Henri Vuitton had struck a devil's bargain to collaborate with the Vichy regime and its German patrons in order to keep his family's business alive. As the officer finally left, Henri exhaled in relief. He had just sold a piece of luggage to the enemy, and in doing so, bought his family's legacy a little more time. It was a deal with darkness, one that would remain a closely guarded secret for decades. This is the dark story of the Louis Vuitton family estate, a tale of ambition and innovation, of glamour and survival, and of secrets hidden behind a monogrammed facade. It begins with the journey of an impoverished teenage boy and ends with the empire he built slipping from his family's grasp. It's a story that spans from the deep forests of rural France to the gilded salons of Second Empire Paris, from the turmoil of world wars to cutthroat corporate boardrooms. To understand how an empire of luxury was forged, and how it was nearly undone by tragedy and scandal, we must travel back to where it all began. Not in Paris, but in a small mountain village in the year 1821. In the remote hamlet of Anchay in eastern France, nestled in the Jura Mountains, a boy named Louis Vuitton was born on August 4, 1821. He came from humble, hard-working stock. His father, François Xavier, was a farmer, and his mother, Caronne, was a miller. Their life was one of simple routines, tied to the rhythms of the land. Young Louis grew up in a stone farmhouse, surrounded by rolling pastures and dense, ancient forests. He was just 10 years old when his mother fell ill and died, a tragedy that shook his small world. In the wake of Caronne's death, Louis's father swiftly remarried. Louis's new stepmother, a strict and unsympathetic woman, did little to hide her scorn for the boy. The farmhouse that had once been warm with his mother's love now felt cold and oppressive. Louis endured this unhappy home for 3 more years. By the time he was 13, he knew he had to escape. One day in the spring of 1835, Louis Vuitton quietly slipped out the door of his family home, determined never to return. He had little more than the clothes on his back and a few francs in his pocket. Thus began a remarkable journey, a 292-mile trek on foot across France. The boy trekked through the primeval forests of the Vosges Mountains, sleeping under the stars, doing odd jobs in villages to earn food. He walked for hundreds of kilometers, driven by a dream he could barely articulate: Paris. To a poor boy from the provinces, Paris was a fabled city of opportunity, the place where he could remake himself. It took Louis over 2 years of wandering and work to reach his destination. Along the way, he learned to be resourceful, to observe people, to endure hardship with a quiet grit, qualities that would define him for life. When Louis finally arrived in Paris in 1837, he was 16 and penniless. The city that greeted him was a place of jarring contrasts. On one hand, Paris was the throbbing heart of Europe's industrial revolution, a city in the throes of modernization, where grand boulevards were being cut through medieval streets and railroads were snaking their way toward the capital. On the other hand, widespread poverty clung to Paris like a fog. Homeless families huddled under bridges, rag pickers sorted trash in the alleys. Louis knew hunger and cold from his journey, but Paris offered those in abundance. Still, the boy was determined. He had not walked for months on end just to give up now. He found shelter in a dingy boarding house and survived by doing the only things he knew: hard labor. He hauled lumber at construction sites, swept workshops, ran errands, anything to earn a few sous. Fate intervened one day as Louis looked for work along the bustling Rue Saint-Honoré, a street renowned for its boxmakers and trunk craftsmen. By chance, he impressed the proprietor of a successful packing workshop, Monsieur Romain Maréchal, with his politeness and eagerness. Maréchal was a master trunk maker and packer, and he agreed to take the sturdy country boy on as an apprentice. For Louis, this was a stroke of incredible luck. In 19th century Europe, crafting custom boxes and trunks was a respected trade. Wealthy travelers required skilled artisans to build and pack their luggage for long journeys by carriage, train, or steamship. Under Marechal's tutelage, Louis proved a natural. He had a craftsman's eye for detail and a near-obsessive dedication to quality. Day after day, he learned to saw and plane wood, to shape leather, to fit complex pieces together. He learned how to arrange ladies' elaborate dresses and hats so they would not be crushed in transit, how to waterproof a trunk against the elements, how to secure delicate porcelain so it could survive a bumpy carriage ride. Quiet and focused, Louis absorbed everything. In that crowded little workshop, the teenage apprentice slowly transformed into a master craftsman. Within a few years, Louis Vuitton's skill and reputation were blossoming. Paris's fashionable elite began to hear whispers of a talented boxmaker who could solve any packing problem. If a duchess needed her enormous crinolines packed for a seaside holiday, young Vuitton could devise a custom trunk with compartments and straps to hold every article in place. If an artist needed to transport canvases without damage, Louis would craft a cushioned crate to the exact dimensions. His ingenuity and careful workmanship set him apart from the rest. By the early 1850s, Louis's name quietly circulated in aristocratic circles as one of the city's premier packers. In 1852, history played matchmaker to Louis's destiny. That year, Napoleon III, nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte, took power as emperor of the French peasantry. Paris buzzed with the energy of the new Second Empire. Napoleon III's wife was the fashionable Empress Eugénie de Montijo, and she had a problem that needed solving. As Empress, Eugénie led a glittering life split between the Tuileries Palace in Paris, the Grand Château de Saint-Cloud, and seasonal trips to fashionable retreats like Biarritz. She carried an enormous wardrobe of elegant gowns, furs, hats, and jewels wherever she went. Transporting all these treasures safely was a nightmare. Trunks came back from journeys with gowns wrinkled, feathers crushed, and perfume bottles shattered. Empress Eugénie needed the best packer in Paris. By now, Louis Vuitton had distinguished himself in that rarefied craft. In 1853, the Empress's ladies-in-waiting summoned Louis to the palace and tested his skills with a particularly elaborate packing task. He exceeded their expectations with his clever solutions and meticulous care. Impressed, Empress Eugénie appointed Louis Vuitton her personal boxmaker and packer. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. Overnight, Louis found himself walking through the gilded halls of the Tuileries, ensuring that the Empress's silks and satin shoes traveled as safely as crown jewels. Serving Empress Eugénie was not only a prestigious honor, it was a gateway into the highest echelons of society. Louis's work for her caught the eye of other aristocrats and royal families across Europe. Soon he was receiving commissions from nobility who wanted Louis Vuitton trunks for their own travels. A royal endorsement in the age of empire was priceless. Louis's star was on the rise. 2 years later, in 1854, riding the momentum of his growing fame, Louis Vuitton decided to strike out on his own. At 33 years old, he married Clémence Émilie Pariot, the woman he had loved for years, and with her encouragement, he left Monsieur Marechal's workshop to open his own shop. Louis established Louis Vuitton Mallet meaning trunk maker, a small storefront and atelier on Rue Neuve des Capucines, just north of the Place Vendôme. He purposefully chose that location for its proximity to the fashionable heart of Paris. The Place Vendôme was quickly becoming a symbol of luxury. Within decades, the Hotel Ritz would open there, and designers and jewelers would line its periphery. Louis anticipated this and positioned his boutique to catch the aristocratic foot traffic. At first, Louis's shop was modest. He and a handful of assistants crafting custom boxes and trunks to order. But he had big plans and an innovator's mind. By 1858, just a few years into running his own business, Louis introduced a revolutionary new design that would change luggage forever. Traditional travel trunks of the time had rounded, dome lids, a shape intended to help water run off during travel on carriage roofs or ship decks. But the curved tops made trunks impossible to stack, and they wasted space. Louis observed that one of his London competitors, H.J. Cave, had made some progress with flat-top trunks. Building on that idea, Louis perfected a trunk that was rectangular, stackable, and lightweight, made with a wooden frame and covered in a durable canvas. He chose a distinctive Trianon gray canvas for the cover, a pale gray-coated cloth that made the trunks both waterproof and elegant. These new trunks were a marvel. Not only could they be easily stacked for voyages, but they were also airtight and rugged, protecting their contents from water and damage. The timing of Louis's innovation was perfect. The world was in the midst of a transportation revolution. Steamships crossed the Atlantic, railways crisscrossed Europe, and travelers needed reliable luggage more than ever. Orders poured in for Vuitton's flat-top trunks. Demand grew so high that Louis outgrew his Paris workshop. He needed a bigger space to produce his trunks, away from the crowded city center. In 1859, he moved his workshop and his young family to a new location that would become the heart of the Vuitton family estate, the Parisian suburb of Asnières-sur-Seine. Asnières in the 1860s was a peaceful village upriver from Paris, a short train ride from the city but a world away in atmosphere. Here, Louis built a proper workshop on the banks of the Seine, large enough to meet the booming demand. Next to the workshop, he constructed a charming brick and stone house where his family would live. This way, he could be close to his work while enjoying a healthier environment for his wife and children than the smoky city. The Vuitton family home in Asnières became an integral part of their story, a place where work and life intertwined. Each morning, Louis strolled through a small garden directly into the workshop to oversee production. The workshop bustled with activity, the sound of hammers and chatter of artisans, the smell of fresh-cut leather and wood shavings in the air. In the evenings, the family would gather around the dinner table in the adjacent house, the distant sound of the Seine's waters flowing by. Generations of Vuittons would grow up in that house, and it still stands today as part of the company's living history. The 1860s were a golden age for Louis Vuitton. His trunks were lauded as the finest in France. He continued to innovate new styles to stay ahead of imitators. Business was so good that he eventually opened a second store in Paris, and by 1867 he proudly showcased his trunks at the Universal Exposition in Paris, the world's fair that highlighted industrial and artistic feats. But as with any life, challenges were never far. In 1870, war erupted, the Franco-Prussian War, and Paris was plunged into chaos. The conflict was brutal and swift. By 1871, invading Prussian forces had encircled Paris, bombarding the city in a cruel siege. During this turmoil, tragedy struck the Vuitton enterprise. Louis's workshop in Paris was looted and destroyed amidst the unrest. We can imagine the scene when Louis returned to his ransacked workshop, cabinets emptied, tools stolen, half-finished trunks smashed on the floor. The fruits of decades of labor were gone in an instant. It was a devastating setback. Yet, Louis Vuitton was nothing if not resilient. As soon as the war ended in 1871 and Paris began to recover, he set about rebuilding. With characteristic determination, he reopened a new workshop in the very same neighborhood where the old one had stood. The sight of Parisians picking up the pieces of their lives around him must have been sobering. Paris was scarred, but not broken. Likewise, Louis Vuitton emerged from the Franco-Prussian War, scarred, but not defeated. In fact, adversity only sharpened his drive. Over the next 2 decades, Louis cemented his legacy. In 1889, at the Exposition Universelle held in Paris, a World's Fair marking the centennial of the French Revolution, Louis Vuitton's products received the highest honors, the gold medal and the grand prize. By now, his trunks had traveled across the world, accompanying aristocrats on their grand tours, explorers on expeditions, and wealthy businessmen across oceans. The name Vuitton was becoming synonymous with the finest luggage money could buy. After a lifetime of hard work, Louis Vuitton died on February 27, 1892, at the age of 70. He passed away quietly at his Asnières home, surrounded by the family and the business he had built from nothing. He was buried in a simple grave, perhaps a humble resting place for a man whose name would soon be known across the globe. Louis left behind a thriving company and a young family to carry it on. Control of Louis Vuitton Malatier passed to his only son, Georges Vuitton. Georges was 36 years old when his father died, ambitious, energetic, and ready to take the brand his father created to even greater heights. Georges had essentially grown up in the trunk-making business, learning at his father's side. He inherited his father's inventive spirit and keen business mind, but he was also very much a man of his time. The turn of the 20th century, an era of global expansion and branding. One of Georges Vuitton's first major acts was to transform his father's work into what we might recognize as a modern luxury brand. In the 1890s, Vuitton trunks were popular, so popular in fact, that imitators and counterfeiters had begun copying the designs. Back then, there were no robust intellectual property laws to stop them. So in 1896, just a few years after taking over, Georges introduced a distinctive new canvas pattern that would make his products instantly recognizable and protect against copycats. It was a bold graphic design featuring the interlocking letters LV and an array of symbols, quatrefoils, flowers, diamonds, inspired in part by Japanese family crests that Georges admired. This pattern, combined with a checkerboard damier pattern he also introduced, became the world's first designer logo print, a monogrammed canvas that shouted, "This is an original Louis Vuitton." It was a stroke of marketing genius. The monogram not only deterred counterfeiters, at least for a while, but it also turned Louis Vuitton into more than a maker of luggage. It became a status symbol. Owning a piece of luggage with the LV monogram signified one's membership in the club of worldly luxury travelers. Georges didn't stop at the monogram. Around the same time, he tackled another challenge that plagued travelers: theft. Together with his father, in the early 1880s, he had developed a new unpickable trunk lock. To prove its efficacy, the Vuittons famously challenged none other than Harry Houdini, the great escape artist, to break out of a Louis Vuitton locked trunk. Houdini, who could slip free of handcuffs and jail cells, reportedly could not defeat the Vuitton lock. The publicity from this stunt further enhanced the aura around the brand. Louis Vuitton trunks were secure as well as stylish. As the 20th century dawned, Georges Vuitton set his sights on international expansion. He knew that the wealthy American elite were a ripe market for luxury luggage. In 1893, he personally traveled to the Chicago World's Fair to exhibit Vuitton products and drum up interest. The trip was a success. Orders from the United States began to flow in. By 1900, the Vuitton name was known in cosmopolitan cities worldwide. In 1914, as the crowning achievement of his expansion, Georges opened an imposing Louis Vuitton flagship store on the Champs-Élysées in Paris, then the most prestigious shopping avenue in the world. It was the largest travel goods store on the planet at that time, a magnificent building with Art Nouveau touches and the Vuitton name emblazoned high above, beckoning to well-heeled shoppers on the boulevard. For the opening, the family even installed a whimsical feature at street level, a small dog bar, essentially a water fountain for the pets of their wealthy clientele to drink from while their owners perused trunks inside. Georges had thought of everything, an early nod to customer service and luxury experience. Under Georges' leadership, Louis Vuitton evolved from a trunk maker into a purveyor of a lifestyle of travel and elegance. New products rolled out to accompany the changing modes of travel. In 1901, Vuitton introduced the steamer bag, a small duffel meant to fit inside larger trunks. By the 1910s and 1920s, as automobiles and ocean liners proliferated, the company expanded its range to include items like special suitcases for automobile spare tires, picnic sets, and luxurious vanity cases for long voyages. Georges' innovations kept the brand at the forefront of luxury travel goods. Georges Vuitton guided the company through World War I and the tumultuous 1920s. During the Great War, 1914 to 1918, international travel largely halted, but Vuitton survived by catering to the local elite and French officers. After the war, in the Roaring Twenties, travel boomed again. Flappers and moguls crisscrossed the Atlantic on liners like the Olympic and the Majestic, laden with Vuitton luggage. In 1930, Vuitton debuted the Keepall, a supple canvas weekender bag that perfectly captured the spirit of the age. Prosperous folks suddenly had the luxury of quick trips, and they needed a versatile bag for the journey. 2 years later came the Noé bag, originally commissioned by a champagne maker to transport bottles without breaking. Indeed, it fits several champagne bottles neatly. And in 1934, Georges even introduced a handbag that he made especially for fashion legend Coco Chanel, a structured bowler-shaped purse that would later be known as the Alma. Coco Chanel herself carried it, giving Vuitton additional cachet in haute couture circles. By the mid-1930s, the Louis Vuitton company stood atop the world of luxury luggage. It had weathered wars, welcomed the rise of the automobile and airplane, and continued to be synonymous with quality and prestige. The family behind the brand was also riding high. The Vuittons were wealthy, respected, and tightly knit. The Asnières family estate thrived with multiple generations living on the property. Patriarch Georges Vuitton was aging but content, having ably continued his father's vision. His children and grandchildren were poised to carry the business forward. Yet, even as the Vuittons enjoyed their prosperity, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Clouds that would soon engulf all of Europe and bring the Vuitton family to a fateful crossroads. In 1936, Georges Vuitton died at the age of 79, passing the torch to the next generation just as the world hurtled toward another war. Georges' son, Gaston Louis Vuitton, known simply as Gaston, took over leadership of the company. Gaston was actually Louis's grandson, named in part after his grandfather, and he had been involved in the business for years, cultivating an image as a refined gentleman and a collector of rare trunks and curios. Gaston represented the third generation of Vuittons, and he inherited a company at its zenith, but also on the brink of the most challenging era in its history. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, igniting World War II. Within months, the conflagration spread, and soon France itself was in peril. Gaston Louis Vuitton, at age 53, surely understood what war could mean for his luxury business. After all, he'd heard stories of how his grandfather's shop was looted in 1871, and how World War I had pinched trade. But the speed of France's downfall in 1940 took everyone by surprise. The German blitzkrieg tore through France in the spring of 1940. By June, Paris fell under Nazi occupation. The French government fled south to establish a collaborationist regime in Vichy, a spa town. France was effectively split in two, the north under direct German occupation, and the south ruled by Marshal Philippe Pétain's collaborationist government loyal to the Nazis. For French businesses, these were desperate times. Many shuttered, and many more struggled to survive under harsh restrictions. For a luxury house like Louis Vuitton, so tied to travel and the cosmopolitan lifestyle, war threatened total ruin. Who would buy elegant luggage when the world was on fire? And worse, what if the Germans confiscated their assets or factories? Gaston Louis Vuitton faced agonizing choices. Above all, he felt a deep obsession with saving the company his grandfather built, no matter the cost. This is where the Vuitton story takes its darkest turn. Gaston decided that to save the family business, the Vuittons would have to cooperate with the enemy to an extent. He turned to his eldest son, Henri Vuitton, for the most sensitive tasks. Henri Vuitton was Gaston's heir apparent, a young man in his late 20s when the war began. Before the war, Henri had been a rising star in the firm, working alongside his father and learning the ropes. He was refined and charismatic, with an innate talent for sales. Now, as France fell to the Nazis, Henri was tasked with ensuring Louis Vuitton's survival at all costs. According to family accounts and historical research, Gaston gave Henri a clear directive: forge friendly ties with the Vichy regime. Do whatever is necessary to keep the Vuitton stores open and the business running. It was a dangerous gambit, one that many would later question ethically. But in the zero-sum environment of occupied France, the Vuittons were not alone in choosing collaboration over destruction. Henri Vuitton proved quite adept at this grim duty. When Marshal Pétain set up his government headquarters at the luxurious Hôtel du Parc in Vichy, many high-end shops in the area were ordered to close, including jewelers like Van Cleef and Arpels. But Henri managed to have the Vuitton boutique inside the Hôtel du Parc remain open, the only shop allowed to trade in that prime location. This special treatment did not come by accident. Henri ingratiated himself with the new powers. He became a regular face at a certain local café in Vichy, a place frequented by German Gestapo officers and French milice, paramilitary police, loyal to the regime. Over cups of coffee and cognac, Henri made connections. He offered the officers small gifts, no doubt, and emphasized that Louis Vuitton was eager to support the regime's needs. It wasn't long before this friendliness paid off. The Vichy government, eager to encourage loyal businessmen, bestowed an honor on Henri Vuitton. He became one of the first French citizens decorated by Pétain's regime for his collaboration and loyal service. The sight must have been surreal. Henri, the grandson of Louis, receiving a medal from a government that was actively working with Nazi Germany. At the same time, behind closed doors, an even more troubling project was underway. To further prove their usefulness and allegiance, the Vuitton family opened a factory dedicated to producing artifacts glorifying Marshal Pétain. In this factory, workers churned out thousands of plaster busts of Pétain, as well as other pro-regime trinkets. In fact, records suggest more than 2,500 busts of Pétain were made under the Vuitton's direction. These would have been displayed in offices and schools, propagating the Marshal's cult of personality. Every piece of evidence suggests that the Vuitton leadership, Gaston and Henri, knew exactly what they were doing. Part of it was cold business calculation. They were determined to see the Vuitton name survive the war, and if that meant currying favor with fascists, they would do so. Another part, perhaps, was ideological sympathy. Some accounts hint that the Vuittons, like many in the French upper class at the time, harbored right-wing authoritarian leanings and saw Pétain as a stabilizing figure. Regardless of motive, the end result was clear. Throughout World War II, while many French businesses were impoverished or destroyed, Louis Vuitton not only survived, it profited. Its privileged shop in Vichy served the rich and powerful of the collaborationist government. Its factory turned out propaganda pieces for the regime, and its brand likely adorned the luggage of high-ranking officials traveling between occupied Paris and Vichy. Of course, this dark chapter was not one the family would ever advertise. After the war, the details of Vuitton's collaboration remained shrouded in silence, known only to the family and a few close observers. But one can imagine the disquieting scenes during those years. Henry Vuitton sharing a table with German officers, forcing a laugh at their jokes. Gaston receiving reports about sales figures from the Vichy store, even as news of battles and deportations filtered through. All the while, outside the windows of the Vuitton boutique, Europe burned and innocence perished. It was a profound moral compromise. The Vuittons likely told themselves they were doing what they had to do, for family, for legacy, but in doing so, they tethered their illustrious name to one of the darkest regimes in history. Not every member of the Vuitton family was content to wait out the war through collaboration, however. Family letters and accounts suggest internal tensions. Remarkably, even as Henry played the role of collaborator in Vichy, he also served in the French military, at least nominally. When war broke out in 1939, Henry Vuitton enlisted as a volunteer in the French army. He was in his late 20s, and like many young men, perhaps he felt the patriotic pull. He served in a cavalry unit through 1940 until France's defeat. Later, as the tides turned and Allied forces landed in Normandy in 1944, Henry once again volunteered for military service, this time joining a regiment in late August 1944 to assist in the liberation of France. By January 1945, he even held the rank of captain. It's hard to reconcile these two Henrys, the one sipping coffee with the Gestapo, and the one donning a uniform to help liberate his country. Perhaps by 1944, seeing that Germany would lose, Henry understood it was wise to burnish his patriotic credentials, or perhaps deep down he felt guilt and wanted a chance at redemption. History leaves us to speculate. What we do know is that by late 1944, as Paris was liberated and the Vichy regime collapsed, those who had collaborated were often treated harshly. Public reprisals against collaborators, from shaming and head-shaving to imprisonment and execution, swept through France. The Vuittons must have been extremely nervous. In those chaotic months, Gaston and Henry reportedly took steps to hide any evidence of their wartime dealings. Indeed, years later, the company would claim that all documents from the 1930s and 1940s were lost in a fire, a suspiciously convenient loss. One imagines bonfires in the courtyard of the Asnières workshop in late 1944, as Vuitton employees hastily burned papers, invoices to Vichy officials, correspondence with German clients, factory records of those 2,500 Pétain busts. If such a bonfire occurred, it was successful. In the official company archives, virtually nothing remains from 1933 to 1945. It is a conspicuous hole in an otherwise proud timeline. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the Louis Vuitton business had survived intact, even strengthened in some ways, but at a moral cost that the family would spend decades sweeping under the rug. Gaston Louis Vuitton emerged publicly as a respectable businessman who had weathered the war, but quietly he must have known the stain that lay on the family legacy. If any authorities did investigate the Vuittons for collaboration, it seems they escaped serious consequences. Given that Henry had also served in the Free French forces in 1944, perhaps that helped shield them. In post-war France, a certain "let's move on" attitude prevailed once the worst collaborators were punished. Many businesses that had cooperated to survive simply went back to business under the new republic, and people preferred not to ask too many questions. The Vuittons likely fell into this category. The immediate post-war years brought other changes and challenges for the family. As France rebuilt under the Fourth Republic, travel resumed and demand for luxury goods slowly picked up. In 1946, the Vuitton company finally began to fill in that conspicuous gap in its timeline. Gaston set about modernizing and re-energizing the brand after the war-induced stagnation. Henry Vuitton, despite the shadow of Vichy, took on a key role in the business once more. In 1945, Gaston officially appointed Henry as the manager of the Paris shop on Avenue des Champs-Élysées. Henry threw himself into the work, perhaps eager to focus on the future and distance himself from the past. His daughter later recalled that "Daddy was working a lot. I have never seen him on holiday." Such was Henry's devotion to rebuilding the business and maybe his reputation. Through the late 1940s, the Louis Vuitton brand quietly regained its footing. Tourists returned to Paris, and with them came a renewed appetite for the luxury that Louis Vuitton offered. The company still specialized in luggage, but the nature of travel was evolving. Air travel was becoming more common. Cars were a primary mode for shorter trips. To keep up, Vuitton had to innovate yet again. One persistent issue was that their signature canvas, though durable, was too stiff to be used for the new styles of soft luggage and handbags that modern customers wanted. All their classic trunks and suitcases were made with a rigid frame. In 1959, Gaston and Henry achieved a breakthrough. They developed a new, more supple version of the coated canvas, lighter and able to be formed into handbags and smaller accessories. This might seem technical, but it was transformative. With this innovation, Louis Vuitton could expand beyond just travel trunks and bags into the world of personal accessories, wallets, purses, and beyond. It opened the door to the vast product range we see today. The 1950s and 60s became a period of expansion and diversification for Louis Vuitton. Gaston Louis Vuitton, aging but still active, watched as his children carried the business into new territory. Henry in particular blossomed in this era as a creative force. Once freed from his reputation as merely his father's apprentice, Henry proved himself an able designer and idea man. Starting in 1959, Henry began designing dozens of new products each year. Everything from the now iconic Speedy bag, a smaller handbag version of the Keepall, to elegant purses and practical wallets. Many of these were instant hits and remain staples in the Louis Vuitton lineup even today. Henry's daughter recalls how her father would spend endless hours sketching and making mock-ups, chasing the next great idea. At long last, Gaston recognized Henry's contributions. By the early 1960s, he finally regarded his son as a man and not just an overgrown apprentice, which greatly pleased Henry. While Henry drove product innovation, Gaston's daughters were not idle either. One of Gaston's daughters, Odile Vuitton, inherited her family's ambition. She married a businessman named Henry Racamier, a shrewd and polished man who operated in the steel industry. As the years went on, Odile and Henry Racamier would become increasingly involved in the family enterprise. But in the 1950s and 60s, they watched Gaston and Henry Vuitton steer the ship. It wasn't all smooth sailing, however. The Vuitton family suffered personal tragedies and changes in this era as well. Back in 1929, Gaston's youngest child, a little daughter, had died at the age of 4. A heartbreak that left Gaston's wife Renée devastated and even caused her to lose her hearing from the trauma. That sorrow never fully left the family. And shortly after World War II, in January 1947, Henry's own young son Philippe, just 9 years old, fell ill and passed away. The loss of Philippe, Henry's only son, was a crushing blow. Henry soldiered on with his work, but his daughter noted a sadness in him from that point on. The Vuitton family, for all their success, were no strangers to heartbreak, the kind that strikes in private, behind the walls of their estate, away from the public eye. By the mid-1960s, Gaston Louis Vuitton was in his 80s. He had led the company for 3 tumultuous decades, since 1936, through war and reinvention. In 1970, Gaston passed away at the age of 87, marking the end of the third generation's reign. With Gaston gone, the business now truly belonged to his children. Gaston's direct successor as president was not Henry, interestingly, but his daughter Odile Vuitton Racamier. Odile, a capable woman who had been involved in the background, took on the mantle of leadership, at least nominally, after her father's death. However, Odile's husband, Henry Racamier, who had joined the family business, soon became the driving managerial force. Henry Racamier was an outsider by birth, but had the Vuitton family's trust. In 1977, as the company needed fresh energy, Henry Racamier assumed the role of president of Louis Vuitton, with Odile's blessing. Henry Vuitton, Gaston's son, by this time was in his mid-60s. He stepped back from day-to-day management and let his brother-in-law Racamier take the reins, though Henry Vuitton still came to the office regularly well into the 1980s. When Racamier took charge in 1977, Louis Vuitton was still a prestigious name, but a relatively small family-run house. To give a sense, the company had just 2 boutiques and annual revenues around 10 million francs, only a few million US dollars. In the mid-1970s, it was profitable and respected, but nowhere near the global giant it would later become. Racamier had a bold vision. He foresaw an era of global luxury retail, where Louis Vuitton would need to be present in every fashion capital and beyond. Under his leadership, the late 1970s and 1980s saw explosive expansion. They opened the first Louis Vuitton stores in Japan in 1978 to one in Tokyo and one in Osaka, tapping into a market that would become obsessed with luxury brands. The Japanese fell in love with Vuitton. By the 1980s, it was said that a Louis Vuitton bag on the arm was the ultimate status symbol in Tokyo. Racamier also pushed into new markets in the United States and Europe. New York got a flagship in 1981, followed by stores in cities like London, Geneva, and Hong Kong in rapid succession. The Vuittons became globetrotters themselves. Henry Vuitton and his wife were often sent as brand ambassadors to attend store openings, lending a familial charm and legacy aura to these events. The sight of the elegant older Henry and his wife stepping off a plane in some far-flung locale, greeted by paparazzi as they came to cut the ribbon on a boutique, became a regular occurrence. By 1985, Louis Vuitton had introduced new product lines like the Epi leather collection, a colored leather with a textured grain, and business was booming like never before. The numbers told the story. In 1977, revenue was 70 million francs. By 1987, only 10 years later, it had multiplied many times over, and the brand was operating over 130 stores worldwide. The family that once ran a single workshop by the Seine now presided over an international network spanning continents. Louis Vuitton had truly become, as Adolphus Busch once dubbed his beer, the king, in this case the king of luxury travel goods. However, this meteoric expansion set the stage for a dramatic twist that would test the Vuitton family in a new way. As the company grew, it attracted attention from investors and other businesses in the luxury sector. In the mid-1980s, an opportunity arose to merge Louis Vuitton with another French luxury power, the champagne and cognac producer Moet et Chandon and Hennessy. Moet Hennessy was itself the result of a 1971 merger between those two venerable drinks companies, and by the 1980s it was looking to diversify. The idea was floated to create a conglomerate that would combine wines and spirits with high-end fashion and leather goods, covering a broad spectrum of luxury. Henry Racamier, always looking to strengthen Vuitton's future, found the idea intriguing. In 1987, the merger went ahead. Louis Vuitton merged with Moet Hennessy to form a new entity called LVMH. Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy. It was one of the first luxury conglomerates of its kind, a move that anticipated how many luxury brands would later consolidate. At the time of the merger, the Vuitton family, through Odile and her siblings, held a significant stake in the new LVMH, and Henry Racamier assumed a high-ranking role on the board. Initially, it seemed like a partnership of equals between the Vuitton clan and the Champagne families, the Moet and Hennessy clans. But business marriages can be as tricky as personal ones. It didn't take long for strategic rifts to appear between Racamier and his new partners. Specifically, Racamier found himself at odds with Alain Chevalier, the CEO of Moet Hennessy, over how the new conglomerate should be run. Tensions simmered, threatening to derail the synergy they had hoped for. Sensing that he might need allies in the boardroom, Henry Racamier made a fateful decision. He reached out to a relatively young French businessman who had made a splash a few years earlier by taking over the struggling textile firm that owned Christian Dior. That man's name was Bernard Arnault. Racamier saw Arnault as a potential ally, someone with financial acumen, who could buy into LVMH and support the Vuitton family's vision against the Moet Hennessy side. In 1988, acting with Racamier's encouragement, Bernard Arnault began purchasing shares of LVMH. What Racamier underestimated, however, was Arnault's ambition and cunning. Arnault did not earn the nickname the Wolf in Cashmere for nothing. Behind his polished demeanor was a fiercely strategic mind, ready to pounce. In July 1988, Arnault made a bold move. He secretly teamed up with a major investor, the Guinness family of Irish beer fame, to acquire a large block of LVMH shares. By the time Racamier realized what was happening, Arnault had amassed a formidable stake in the company. Arnault then leveraged a controversial stock warrants issue, financial instruments that gave him voting rights, and continued buying stock aggressively. The Vuitton family and their allies were caught off guard. By 1989, Bernard Arnault had effectively wrested control of LVMH, having secured roughly 35% of the voting shares, enough to dominate the board. In the corporate battle that ensued, Racamier and Arnault accused each other of bad faith. Racamier tried legal challenges to block Arnault's maneuvers, but to no avail. Finally, in 1990, after a tumultuous 2-year struggle, the end came. A French court upheld Arnault's tactics and his stake, solidifying Arnault's control over LVMH. At a board meeting soon after, The proud 77-year-old Henry Racamier resigned from all his positions, including the chairmanship of Louis Vuitton's division. It was a bitter defeat. The man who had spent over a decade building Louis Vuitton into a global powerhouse was shown the door, outmaneuvered by the very ally he had invited in. The Vuitton family's control over their namesake company was effectively lost at that moment. After 4 generations and 136 years of family ownership, from 1854 to 1990, the empire of Louis Vuitton passed into the hands of someone outside the family. For Henry Racamier and Odile, it was a personal heartbreak. They had fought hard, but the world of modern high finance had overtaken the old ways of family business. Racamier, dignified even in defeat, famously said he was bowing out after the court decision. But the pain was evident. He soon launched a new luxury venture of his own, perhaps to soothe the sting, even acquiring the venerable Lanvin fashion house to try to build a rival group. Yet LVMH was unstoppable under Arnault's command. Bernard Arnault went on to build LVMH into the world's largest luxury conglomerate, with Louis Vuitton as its crown jewel. By the 2000s and beyond, Louis Vuitton would be named the most valuable luxury brand on earth, multiple times, its stores multiplying like never before. In an ironic twist, the business that the Vuitton family protected at all costs, even through deals with the devil, had flourished mightily, but no longer under their stewardship. And what of the Vuitton family estate at Asnières? That cherished hub of family and craft lived on. Even as corporate ownership changed, the Asnières workshop remained a vital part of Louis Vuitton. The family home there, where Louis and Georges and Gaston had lived and where generations were raised, was preserved. In later years, it was turned into a private museum of sorts, showcasing trunks from the past and the heritage of the brand. Members of the Vuitton family continued to visit and sometimes consult in honorary roles, but decision-making was now firmly in the hands of LVMH's appointed executives. The dark secrets the family held on to, particularly the wartime collaboration, remained mostly hidden from the public until the 21st century. It wasn't until 2004 that a French author, Stéphanie Bonvicini, published a book titled Louis Vuitton, a French saga which finally pulled back the curtain on the Vuitton's wartime activities. By then, all the main actors, Gaston, Henry, even Racamier, were gone or elderly. Henry Vuitton had died in 2002 at 91, taking his memories with him. The book's revelations confirmed the rumors that the Vuittons had cozied up to Pétain, kept their shop open while others closed, and produced those busts of the dictator. The modern Louis Vuitton company, now part of LVMH, quickly distanced itself, with a spokesman dismissing it as ancient history, from a time long before LVMH. They did not deny the facts, but they emphasized that the values of the company had changed. Indeed, by the 2000s, Louis Vuitton was eager to be seen as a diverse and progressive luxury brand, far removed from any taint of Vichy. Still, the story was a sobering reminder that behind even the most glamorous brands, there can lie shadows. Looking back over the century and a half of the Louis Vuitton family saga, one can't help but marvel at the contrasts. Here was a family that rose from rural poverty to serve empresses and world's fairs, whose very name became a global byword for luxury. They navigated wars and reinvented themselves across generations. They fiercely protected their legacy, whether by innovation, generosity, or unsavory alliances, only to ultimately lose that legacy in a corporate power play. Triumph and tragedy walked hand in hand. For the Vuittons, in the halls of their Asnières estate, joyous occasions like weddings and the birth of children were tempered by sorrowful ones, like premature funerals. The same walls that echoed with celebration also heard whispers of family disputes and desperate strategies during the war. Today, the Louis Vuitton brand is stronger than ever, adorning celebrities, sought by millions of consumers, a pillar of the luxury industry. But the Louis Vuitton family are no longer the ones steering that ship. They are part of the brand's lore and history, much like the old trunks displayed in flagship stores, evoking a bygone era. The family estate at Asnières stands as a beautiful relic, a museum piece of what once was, where you can almost sense the spirit of young Louis crafting his first trunk, or of Georges plotting his next innovation, or of Gaston brooding over the war, or of Henry waving goodbye as he leaves for another store opening abroad, unaware that it will all one day slip away. In the end, the story of the Louis Vuitton family estate is a human story, of vision and perseverance, but also of the moral complexities that come with protecting a legacy. It shows that behind the polished monogram canvas lies a history woven with both light and dark threads. As visitors stroll down the Champs-Élysées or Fifth Avenue today, admiring the shiny Louis Vuitton boutiques, Few would guess the full measure of sacrifice and secrets that built that empire. But now you know the tale. The dark story of the Louis Vuitton family, from the little boy who ran away from home to the empire that nearly fell to pieces, and all the ambition, love, compromise, and intrigue in between. It's a reminder that great fortunes often carry great shadows, and that even the house of a king, the king of luxury, can have ghosts in its halls.